You're listening to Catholic Chicago. Ahead, the Archdiocese of Chicago brings you programs about the people, events, and issues that touch our lives. Welcome to Catholic Chicago.
Welcome to Beyond the Headlines. My name is Joyce DeRiga. I'm editor of the Chicago Catholic, the newspaper for the Archdiocese of Chicago. And this is where we talk to people who are making the news and the stories that we're covering in the Chicago Catholic. So today we have as our guest, Don Eden Goldstein, who wrote a book last year, I think it came out, Father Ed, the Story of Bill W.'s Spiritual Sponsor. So if you're watching on YouTube, I'll hold the book up. Oh, she's got it too. It's a very good book, well researched. You can see it's nice and thick. There's Chicago connections, so there's something for everybody. And most of us know somebody in 12-step programs or have been in them ourselves. So there's a lot of connections that people can have. And you know, he was Catholic ministering to non-Catholics, so there's that story too. So Dawn, welcome. And Dawn has her own ties to here in Chicago, so we'll get to that later. But can you give us, I know it's a big book, and can you kind of talk about Father Ed's beginnings and, you know, then how he got connected to the Jesuit community?
Sure. So Father Edward Dowling was born in St. Louis. He got the childhood nickname Puggy because of his pug nose. He was first interested in baseball, was a star player in high school and in college. And then, I should add, he was born in 1898, died in 1960. And so he entered, well, actually, before he entered the Society of Jesus, he spent a year as a daily newspaper reporter in St. Louis. And he maintained his contacts with his newspaper friends throughout his life. Then at the age of 21 in 1919, he entered the Society of Jesus. Did he want me to go all the way up to his meeting Bill W., or did he want me to pause there?
So some of the things I thought we could talk about was, well, let's start with his experience as a life of a Jesuit. It wasn't what he expected when it started out, and then we can go into, and we should mention, you mentioned this before we started recording, that today we're recording on what I always consider the feast day so it's Father Ed's feast day, or the day he died. So we've got a special intercession with Father Ed today. But yeah, tell us about what happened when he entered the Jesuits and why it was such a struggle for him.
Well, young Puggy Dowling, when he entered the Society of Jesus, he entered it because he wanted to be a saint. He wanted to be holy. And he felt that being a Jesuit was how God was going to make him holy. And that did happen ultimately, but not quite the way he thought it would happen. He had this vision in his mind that as soon as he put on the Jesuit cassock, he was going to just sort of pick up kind of by osmosis.
Right. If only that would be so easy, right? Yeah.
Yes. That he was going to pick up this kind of aura of holiness from just being in that Jesuit environment. But at the age of 21 in 1919, back then, 21 was a late vocation
right.
for the Jesuits. And so he found himself, surrounded by younger men, many of whom had gone to a seminary high school. So they had more experience in preparing directly for the priesthood. And he had, devoted so much of his life to things like, sports, and then to newspaper journalism, that he just felt like a fish out of water in the Jesuit novitiate. Also, the Jesuits at that time were known as God's Marines. They
Wow.
were known as this society that had military-like discipline, and the way that played out in the Jesuit novitiate in Florissant, Missouri, was that there were bells every 15 minutes, and no matter what you were doing, you had to drop it and do the next thing.
Wow.
Each 15 minutes. So 15 minutes of reading Imitation of Christ, then 15 minutes of this kind of labor, then 15 minutes of reading the reciting the office, and blah blah blah. So very quickly he got overwhelmed and felt he was in the wrong place, but because he had all his hopes up on how this was how God was going to make him holy, he ended up entering into this existential spiritual crisis, wondering if even there was a God, because his whole image of God's plan for him seems to be just shattered. So later on, when he ministered to members of Alcoholics Anonymous, even though he himself was, I should emphasize, not an alcoholic, although he had other things he struggled with, like cigarette and food addiction. But later on, he described his time in the novitiate as like his equivalent of an alcoholic's hitting bottom, and also of his equivalent of really going through that third step of AA. I have to double check the steps in the back of my book to make sure I'm getting them right. But yeah, the third step of AA is made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. Well, that's what he, as a non-alcoholic, went through in the novitiate, and it took a while. It took the entire novitiate for him to really come to that surrender. But ultimately, he decided that he was going to step out in the faith that God existed, and in the faith that the Society of Jesus was where God was calling him. And after making that decision, he felt great consolation. But because he waited until the last minute, right up until the vows that he was to take at the end of the 2-year novitiate, he took as his vow saint, because Jesuits take a vow saint like the way that people who are being confirmed take a confirmation saint. His vow saint was Saint Dismas, the good thief who got into paradise, into heaven at the last minute.
That's too funny. So let's talk about his Chicago connections. One, he got a tryout with the Chicago White Sox before he entered the novitiate, which is pretty cool. And then, but you talk about in the book that this is where he found Alcoholics Anonymous. Can you share that story?
Yes. So from Father Ed's. So after he was ordained, he was ordained in 1931, and then in 1940. So 9 years into his priesthood, and he was based in St. Louis as the associate editor at a Jesuit publishing house called the Queen's Work. He stayed in touch with his old journalism friends, including a reporter from the Chicago Daily News named Edwin Leahy. I've been permitted by Leahy's daughter, actually, to break his anonymity, because normally one respects the anonymity of members of AA. So Leahy was a terrible drunk, and his alcoholism had already led his wife to become estranged from him. She went to stay with family and took their 2 baby girls, whom they had adopted from the St. Vincent's orphanage in Chicago,
which some became Catholic Charities. We were housed there at one point, but go ahead.
Oh, so yeah, I know there's a whole kind of culture, and almost like a kind of mythology, not like as in untrue, but just a sort of whole kind of culture of people who are interested in that orphanage, because so many thousands of people were adopted from it. Anyway, so his wife and his wife had run off to family with the two babies, and he was on the verge of getting fired from his Chicago Daily News job. And you know, reporters drank so much in those days that one can only imagine how badly
Right.
Edwin A. Leahy was drinking in order to be on the verge of being fired from the Chicago Daily News. So it was actually a nun, Sister Mary Alice, I think her name was Sister Mary Alice Rowan, I believe. I have her name in Father Ed, uh, but um, but she contacted um, Father Dowling and said, you know, your friend Leahy is on the verge of like losing both his marriage and his job. You got to help him. So Father Ed, who had this great gift for helping people with any kind of problem, and this was long before he ever met Bill W., became involved with a ministry to AA. Father Ed managed through his kind of, you know, his gift, his charism, to uh, reunite Edwin Leahy and his wife Grace in Father Ed's office in St. Louis, and he extracted from Leahy a promise that when he went back to Chicago, that he wouldn't drink. But that was really all that Father Ed could do at that time, because Father Ed didn't know about AA, so he couldn't refer uh, Leahy to AA. AA at that time only had a small handful of chapters. It was in New York, Chicago. It wasn't yet in St. Louis. Father Ed would soon change that. And AA had yet to receive national national press. That wouldn't come for uh, another year when it got its first major publicity in the Saturday Evening Post. So Leahy went back to Chicago with his wife in January 1940, end of January. And a few weeks later, when Father Ed was making a speaking a tour to give a talk, because he was in demand on the lecture circuit as an expert on democracy. He stopped in Chicago, made a visit to the Leahys, and he was very happy to find that Leahy still was not drinking, but he was a little unnerved to find that Leahy was now spending time hanging out with his alcoholic reporter friends and other, you know, former drinking buddies in this group that they were calling Alcoholics Anonymous. So Leahy offered to take Father Ed to a business meeting, like an administrative
Sure.
meeting of AA, but where they also had the usual things that happen at a meeting, including the personal testimonies. And when Father Ed went to this meeting and started in Chicago and started to hear the testimonies, Father Ed was immediately transfixed hearing the alcoholics' stories, which are a major part of any AA meeting. You know, the alcoholics minister to one another through sharing their struggles, their triumphs, and whatever they have from the wisdom of experience, and also just sharing their need for one another's
Right.
support and fellowship. They are wounded healers to one another. So Father Ed picked up a copy of the Big Book, which had only been published a year earlier. It was still fairly new, and it included the 12 steps. The Big Book is the manual of AA, which was written by Bill Wilson along with input from Dr. Bob and the first, 100 members of AA. And when Father Ed took the Big Book back to St. Louis with him, he showed it to Father John Marcoux. Father Marcoux would later be known for his work with African Americans, but at that time, Marcoux himself was struggling with alcoholism. And when Marcoux, who also a Jesuit, saw the 12 steps in the Big Book, he pointed out to Father Ed that these 12 steps embody principles that are in the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius.
Right.
St. Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits. Now that really pricked up Father Ed's ears, because Father Ed really credited the spiritual exercises which he had to make in the novitiate for 30 days, as every Jesuit novice does.
We have to
He
take,
credited.
I have to interrupt you for a second. We have to take a quick break. We're kind of
Sure.
over on it, but
I'm
we'll
sorry.
come right back and we'll finish talking about the 12 step or the spiritual exercises and then talking about meeting Bill W. So don't go away, everybody.
Catholic Charities Blossoms of Hope Brunch will be held on Sunday, April 30th at Drury Lane in Oak Brook, in support of the Loving Outreach to Survivors of Suicide program, also known as LOSS. This inspiring brunch is an opportunity for all members of the LOSS community to gather with its founder, Father Charles Ruby, in support of the program and to celebrate the resilience that can be attained over time. For more than 40 years, LOSS has been compassionately accompanying individuals and families on their journey through grief. The program has been recognized by the United Nations as a model for helping those grieving this tragic event in their lives. In-person and online resources help people around the country find healing and joy in life again. To learn more about LOSS and the Blossoms of Hope Brunch, visit CatholicCharities.net.
People always say, how can you spend your day with 3-year-olds? Seeing the changes that they go through and just the journey and how they grow, this is a very rewarding job. Even though at the end of the day, we're not the highest paid people on earth. And when I have a parent contact me and say, my child loves school, that to me, I'm setting that foundation for their love of learning. Because really, you are changing lives. You are molding lives.
Shape the next generation of leaders. Teach. Apply today at archchicago.org/schooljobs.
Catholic Charities' Family Self-Sufficiency Program has assisted thousands of single parents who are working to become more self-sufficient through education and employment opportunities. Our experienced case managers accompany participants for up to 5 years on their journey to identify, address, and break down barriers to improving their quality of life and achieving meaningful goals for themselves and for their families. Professional, compassionate assistance is offered in a safe and trusting environment as participants develop the skills needed to become financially stable and able to support themselves. Every achievement starts with a decision to try. To learn more about Catholic Charities' Family Self-Sufficiency Program, call 847-782-4233 or visit CatholicCharities.net.
Welcome back to Beyond the Headlines. My name is Joyce Duriga. I'm editor of the Chicago Catholic, the newspaper for the Archdiocese. Before we continue our interview today with Don Eden Goldstein, I just want to give a plug for the newspaper. You can visit us at chicagocatholic.com. We have a free newsletter that goes out about 3 times a week you can sign up for. Follow us on social media. You can also support our ministry by subscribing. We come out about every 2 weeks, and subscriptions are $30. And you can keep up to date with the latest Pope news, Cardinal Supich's column, activities going on in the Archdiocese, all that great fun stuff. So welcome back to Dawn Eden. We're talking about Father Ed. We have about 10 minutes left, so I want to get to, I know we were talking about how the 12 steps were similar to the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, but can we jump to how Father Ed met Bill W., which is the crux of your book?
Sure. So Father Ed was fascinated with the 12 steps once it was pointed out to him that they were similar in certain principles to the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, because he credited the spiritual exercises which he made during his novitiate with really enabling him to be secure in his vocation and to find healing and really to go deeper into his faith. He had always wanted, I mean, his dream was to spread knowledge of the spiritual exercises to everyone. So he came to realize that through the 12 steps, the same principles from the exercises that had been so healing to him could be spread not only to Catholics, but to everyone, not non-Catholic and Catholics alike. So he had to find the great spiritual master. He imagined that the person who had written these 12 steps was a master of Ignatian spirituality. So he tracked down Bill W. at the AA clubhouse in New York, and said to him that he said, I'm very interested in the similarities between your 12 steps and the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius Loyola. And Bill Wilson, who was in a very bad mood that day, said, never heard of him. And so Father Ed laughed, and that laugh broke the ice between them. And before Bill knew it, he was doing what people in AA call taking the fifth. Bill was making his fifth step to Father Ed. The fifth step is admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. Now, even though Bill Wilson had written the 12 steps, he hadn't made all of them, because they were based on principles, wisdom gathered from, not just Bill's experience, but the experience of other members of AA. From that day on, Father Ed became a spiritual advisor and mentor to Bill Wilson. Their friendship lasted 20 years from when they met in November 1940 until Father Ed's death, April 3rd, 1960. And Bill called Father Ed, after Father Ed's death, Bill called him the greatest human being I shall ever know. And even during Father Ed's lifetime, Bill was confiding in a mutual friend that he believed Father Ed was a living saint. I think a lot of people don't know the extent to which a Jesuit priest influenced the spiritual development of Bill Wilson personally, and also of AA. When Bill was writing the other major book of AA besides the big book, namely 12 Steps and 12 Traditions, Bill not only incorporated wisdom that he had gained from his conversations and letters with Father Ed, but Bill also asked Father Ed to be one of these religious experts vetting the manuscript. Father Ed had a direct influence on AA spirituality, and he also, even more, had an influence on the spread of the 12 steps in general. Father Ed was the first person to really champion the 12 steps very publicly for people who needed to help overcoming any problem, not just alcoholism. He started the first AA chapter in St. Louis, started the first Narcotics Anonymous chapter in St. Louis. And perhaps most importantly, Father Ed spent an enormous amount of energy working to convince other religious leaders, not just Catholics, that religious leaders should embrace AA. Because at that time, early in AA's history, religious leaders were suspicious of it, because Bill had originally received some Christian formation in this sect known as the Oxford Group, a Protestant sect. Bill didn't stay with the Oxford Group, but there was this suspicion that maybe AA was some sort of, some sort of cult.
Right.
And so Father Ed did a great deal of work convincing other religious leaders that AA wouldn't take people away from whatever faith they were practicing. Rather, it would help them to go deeper into the faith that they had.
Well, and that's ironic because one of the things about AA or 12-step programs is that you don't really talk about God. It's a God of your understanding. It's your preaching. You may believe on the outside of Jesus or Buddha or Muhammad, but you don't, bring that in as sort of, so that's kind of ironic, but it makes sense. So we have just like 2 minutes left. So how did this, you're not in 12-step program, so how did this affect you? If you can kind of just wrap that up for us, and then we'll.
Sure. Well, as a non-alcoholic myself, I was interested in writing about Father Ed because I was just so touched by the story of this Jesuit who was a non-alcoholic, who had such a heart to help not only alcoholics, but anyone with a problem. People said of Father Ed that they felt more comfortable coming to him with a problem than without one. They said, if you don't have a problem, Father Ed will find you slightly boring. So, every day outside his office at this Jesuit publishing house, there would be a line of people like throughout the day from all walks of life, from high society right down to unhoused people coming to him for assistance. And he helped them both spiritually and in practical ways. So I can't even begin to describe how much he has influenced my life, both in terms of really making me think more about the mercy of God, which was something that was very important to him to convince people of, but also just in helping me to be more outer directed as he was.
That's wonderful. So for all of those who are listening on the radio or watching this on YouTube, I encourage you to go out and get Don's book. It's Father Ed. I'm reading all these videos. I'm reading the cameras. The story of Bill W.'s spiritual sponsor. It's published by Orbis Book, but you can also get it on Amazon.com. Don, thank you so much for joining us today and taking out. I know it was kind of a crazy day for you, so I appreciate you sharing Father Ed's story and more about the spirituality of AA. It's all important to get out there. So thanks again, and to everyone who's listening or watching, I hope you have a gentle and joyful day, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. God bless.
You're welcome, Don.